Coast Guard. We're going to keep, I want to thank our panel for all the hard work and preparation you did to be here today and to share your expertise. So thank you all. And I know if I weren't chair right now, I would be back with you in the audience anyway. So I'm so glad to be here and be able to be a part. So it's an honor. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and introduce each speaker beforehand, and we'll hear each speaker, and then we'll get our comment from our commentator there, Larry, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end. Okay, so as we are in the program, we'll go ahead and start with Gary Thomas and Master Chief Dietz. Commander Gary Thomas is retired from the Coast Guard as Chief of Electronic Navigation Division of the Coast Guard Headquarters, where he was responsible for all aspects of electronic navigation. Prior to that, he was the last commanding officer of the Loran Support Unit, where he and his crew were responsible for providing material support, repair, guidance, and operational expertise and experience to 29 Loran stations operating in the United States and Canada. Additionally, he has served as a technical representative to several international radio electronic navigation organizations. Commander Thomas has earned permanent cutterman status following 3 tours afloat and is a qualified navigator. He currently serves as the executive director for the Foundation of Coast Guard History. And also another important individual who prepared for this presentation, Master Chief Dietz, is retired from the Coast Guard in 1999, and after 26 years of service. During his career, he served on 5 different Loran stations, Loran A, AC, and C, both overseas and in CONUS, and at the Coast Guard's Navigation Control Center in OSIN and NAVCEN. From tube theory to solid state technology, and from a junior 3rd class to officer at charge, Master Chief gained the knowledge of Loranimal. Master Chief Dietz, as a hobby, has been researching Coast Guard Loran history for greater than 2 decades and hosts an authoritative Loran history website. So thank you, gentlemen, and we'll go ahead and take it away.
First presentation now. So while he pulls the slides up, first I would like to say, because we have a large part of the office here, is that our research has been, you guys have been invaluable in pulling records for us and things like that. So for all the historians, office members here, really appreciate that. And it is a 2-part thing. Master Chief, as very clearly, Master Chief Dietz is the brains, and I'm up here because I'm the beauty. So, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Loran navigation system, which operated for more than 70 years, and its importance to the. So, on-air intolerance were the watchwords for the Coast Guard men and women who manned the Loran system. And by the end of this presentation, you understand that those 4 words reflected a sense of pride and professionalism by those members. Considered one of the top 10 most important technology developments during World War II to the critical victory of the Allies, the design, implementation, operation of the top secret Loran system was very much a product of Coast Guard involvement, and highlights what have always been the key hallmarks of the Coast Guard: the ability to work collaboratively with other agencies, relying on service members' knowledge regardless of rank, and an inclination for action in adverse situations. In this presentation, we hope to provide you with an understanding of the Coast Guard role was played, as well as the influence the program had on the world and the Coast Guard. Next slide, please. The need for an all-weather aid to navigation became apparent early on in the conflict. At the start of World War II, open ocean navigation was accomplished using celestial navigation, as demonstrated by these Dutch sailors on the left. This methodology was no different than those used by sailors 100 years before, who had used this picture didn't come up. The picture that would be an 1848 picture of a map of the Canary Islands, chart, excuse me, is doing the exact same type of navigation. For those of you who've never shot stars, celestial navigation is both an art and a science. The art comes in the ability to try and steadily look at a pinpoint of light through a small lens using one eye. Now imagine those Dutch sailors sitting there in very calm conditions, trying to do the same thing on a ship in a convoy or an aircraft navigator in the conditions of the Northwest Atlantic convoys you see right there during World War II. That art just got very, very difficult, even for the most practiced. As a result, many convoys sailed for days not knowing exactly where they were. When you're trying to rendezvous with other ships to form the convoy or to avoid known positions of German submarines, that location takes on a deadly importance. Next slide, please. So these are notional diagrams, and I'll explain what it is because with understanding a little bit of hyperbolic navigation, I apologize, I have a sinus infection. The development of hyperbolic radio navigation involves physics, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, atmospheric sciences, space weather, geography, oceanography, and it required technology that did not even exist at the time. As exciting as it would be to explain all of those technical details to you, we're going to stay at a very high level this afternoon. Just know is that a lot of very smart people in the fields that we would call STEM today accomplished this in a very short period of time under extraordinary conditions. During World War II, the Loran system was known as Standard Loran. By the end of the war, you will learn, it will eventually be called Loran A, differentiated from the other versions being developed. So I'll explain a little bit of what these amount to. With Loran A, using 2 or more pairs of radio stations, which transmitted very precise and synchronized pulse radio signals, a user can receive those signals, and after determining the time difference of the arrival of signals in microseconds, you can ascertain your position. Now, the radio waves travel a known speed. It's the speed of light. If you know where the signal started from, and you know when you received them, then you can begin to determine your position. You would plot that by showing the lines of, you can see here, lines of the travel, they equate to the time the radio waves would travel over time. So when you can plot 2 of those signals together, where they intersect, right here, for example, would be your position. Now, what does that mean in real life? That's what this picture on the right is. What you have here is Bodie Island, North Carolina, and Nantucket Island up north. Those were 2 of the first testing and operational stations. So those lines would be on a chart. In real life, on the actual navigation chart, much more fine graduation of them to be able to tell your position, but that's basically how it worked. Next slide, please. So by the start of World War II, there were radio-based direction finding systems in existence, but they didn't work well at distance, out either up in the air or out over the open ocean. And that's where they were most critically needed at the time. At the time that the U.S. was looking at this, it was also being investigated by the British, who were already at war. They didn't want to share that information, because we were, although friendly with them, we were not in the war, so we had no stake that they didn't share with us. But in the U.S. in 1940, the research was being conducted by MIT's radiation lab, which was part of the National Defense Research Committee. This is the same group of people who brought radar, sonar, as well as the Manhattan Project. Loran was envisioned and created in that building right there. Very nondescript, as many things happened during the war. As a result of the work of the project, it first became known as Project 3, which if I ever do a science fiction scary book, the movie's going to be Project 3. It was known as Long Range Navigation, or LRN, which eventually became Loran, as the code word which was used as a constructed acronym from LRN. Loran had at heart vacuum tubes like you see in the middle of the picture right there. This was before circuit boards, digital technology, and all that. But don't let that fool you. It was cutting edge technology at the time when we were talking about the development of this system. And while I talked about the practical use of navigation in an ocean environment, Project 3 was actually first created in response to a U.S. Army Signals Corps requirement for precision navigation equipment for guiding aircraft. The Coast Guard involvement started early on when MIT chose to start testing these using abandoned lighthouse or Coast Guard station on Montauk Point and Fenwick Island, Delaware. The reason the MIT leased these abandoned stations wasn't apparent to the Coast Guard at all until the guy in the mugshot on the far right became involved. That mugshot, which is actually a personnel record picture, it's the only known picture of Lieutenant Commander Harding at the time. But we'll hear a little bit more about him as we go on here. Next slide, please. Back. There we go. As the testing and development continued, America then found itself at war following the attack on Pearl Harbor. At the beginning of 1942, the imperative for an all-weather navigation system was ramped up. The British reluctantly sent Robert Dippy, who had been responsible for their development, to help get the program moving along. Before I continue, I need to give you a little bit of organizational Coast Guard of the history. In the spring of 1939, the Coast Guard had very little navigational requirements. They had very little requirement of people with electronic navigation backgrounds. It just wasn't in their suite of responsibilities. Then on July 1st, 1939, the Lighthouse Service merged with the Coast Guard. Lighthouse Service employees were given an option, depending on their experience and their circumstances, to become join as officers or to remain civilians in the new merged organization. Harding chose an officer based on his electronics degrees and experience. So what does that have to do with our story? The first airways navigation systems in the U.S. were not done by anybody but the Lighthouse Service, surprisingly. Now, you would not think that at all, but it's the case. Aircraft would check in by radio with light stations along the coast as they flew along. Very easy and visually to see as you travel along. Eventually, that became a little bit more involved with lights and things like that. As we all know, many ad hoc government programs can morph into permanent programs run by agencies that don't seem to make sense at all of why they had that responsibility. And that was the case here. Soon members of the Lighthouse Service were helping establish airways not only along the coast, but inland too, using both lights and radios. Enter Lieutenant Commander Harding and a number of former Lighthouse Service officers senior to him. These photographs give you a quick overview of what the conditions look like for Loran stations. So you have in the Southwest Pacific, working the trucks were the mobile transmitter, mobile power, hence for the people. In Greenland and Alaska, not the most fun places to be, but that's where they needed to be for the geography and transmitting. What the pictures do not show is the fact that for every one of these sites, the station had to be scouted, considering the radio coverage for each site, the ability to support that location, that the location had the right geography near the ocean and flat, and that it could be get an agreement to actually host it, working between different countries, as well as different agencies and things like that. Harding personally flew, walked, or took small boats to many of the first sites that were determined for their suitability. At the same time, other elements of the Coast Guard were creating construction battalions, or what we all know as CBs, to build out these stations in those circumstances. These typically were construction workers who had civilian careers before they joined the Coast Guard. Still others were helping to build the equipment, while enlisted and officers were attending training how to operate the equipment, with still others training how to fix the equipment. But in theory, no one at the station knew both how to operate it and to fix it, with the idea that from a compartmentalization idea of security, if we caught one person, the Germans wouldn't know both sides of the thing. In reality, like all coasties, if I'm learning how to operate it, at some point I'm going to figure out how to fix it too, because it's just easier to learn that. And that's what we know actually did happen. It was overall what we would call in today's project management world a technical term of nightmare. But the Coast Guard stepped up and they definitely hit a home run. Next, please. So these are some pictures of what you would have seen in the field as a user with them. The first one on the left is an APN-4 Loran receiver. This is what was installed in aircraft. That would have been the first one that was being used. If you were at a monitor station or on board a ship, you would have had used the DAS-3. There was a 1, 2, and 3. L and R, they're all derivations of the same thing. That's in the center picture right there. And if you were flying a B-29 on missions to Japan as a navigator, you would have used an APN-9 receiver, as you see right below the red line there. This section right in here. You will note that this photo is from the Enola Gay, and Loran was used on that aircraft on that mission. One of the things you will notice is that all three have one thing in common, and that is the circular O-scopes that are on those. That is how you remember that little squiggly line from the first page? That's how you would determine the timing sequence, and the difference between them is aligning it on that. System performance was also observed at the monitor stations using that middle device there. Yesterday, as we learned from Donna, the spars were involved in using that monitoring equipment right there. And additionally, performance reports were received from aircraft and ships using Loran to get an idea that we were doing it. The monitoring stations didn't drive the signal, like later systems will, you'll hear, but they did inform everybody of its performance and how well things were going. As a final note, remember the British weren't exactly excited about helping us get involved until we got into the war, and even then they were reluctant. But they did send over Robert Tippy, and he had created their system called G, what might have been one of the first examples of interoperability decisions made in modern warfare. The G receivers and the APN4 right there were interchangeable. They had the same physical chassis, plug in for power. So what did that mean? A British aircraft could fly one day using Loran A for coverage of convoys, could swap out here, and the next day it'd be flying a mission over the continent of Europe. So, next slide, please. So what did the Coast Guard's involvement with Loran lead to? Well, by the war's conclusion, more than 70 Loran stations operated in all conflict zones, the transit zones between them, and covered 63 million square miles of surface of the Earth, roughly 1/3. These circles and arcs indicate the areas we see. You can see that they correspond to the war zones and the transit areas in between. There were 75,000 receivers in use with a fixed accuracy of approximately 1% of the distance from the transmitter. So at 100 miles, it'd be 1 mile off, such as that. Most importantly, though, those fixes could be accomplished in a few minutes in all weather, as compared to the celestial navigation we talked about earlier, which might take 20 minutes or more if all went well. So Loran proved that good enough, done quickly and easily, sometimes is better than perfect, done in 30 minutes or more. Next slide. Although highly classified during the war, a decision was made to declassify the program and allow for its civilian use. It was believed that doing this would help get the world back on its feet following the war. And of course, the Coast Guard was rewarded by continuing to operate the system around the world. So what did that tasking look like? So these three pictures represent Loran A stations post-war. First one is Nantucket Island. You see right there along the beach. Second one is Johnson Island. And the last one is French Frigate Shoals. And if you will notice, clearly, we didn't concern ourselves at all with rising sea levels. And then there are cases in the Pacific where stations were awash during typhoons coming through. So often the crews were the only military for some distance, and in a few cases, the CO was the ranking military officer for the area. Crews received preferential choices for their next duty stations and had extra leave thrown in. The stations remained in isolated areas, but the quality of life for the crews improved. The temporary stations of World War II became more permanent structures with better living conditions. Where the World War II stations were often at the end of supply chains, they had now stations with dedicated support. The Coast Guard cutter Kukui, a World War II era cargo ship, was dedicated to supporting these ships in the Pacific. Cosmic Air, which was a Coast Guard aviation unit, was dedicated solely to providing support of Loran A throughout the Pacific. We also saw advanced enlisted schools to help train several generations of Coast Guard enlisted men with highly technical skills, where before the Coast Guard you came away with very brute force seamanship or below decks engineering skills. Next slide, please. And that wonderful situation lasted about 5 years. When the Korean War started, there was no coverage of Loran in Korea war zone. Suddenly, the Coast Guard found itself again on a wartime footing, trying to quickly establish a line chain to support UN air and sea operations. Called ELMO, Emergency Mobile Loran Operations, with their stations becoming ELMO 1 through 7. What started as small mobile units on the far left, a little more refined than the trucks you saw in World War II. It's still mobile, but it was eventually still placed in very primitive locations, but they evolved over time into much more traditional, secure, built-out stations. Next, please. When the Korean War eventually ended its armistice stage, But the Cold War continued, and Loran remained an important part of DoD's plans. As valuable as Loran A, it didn't meet the accuracy needs of the military. Originally designed for when planes were prop-driven, driven at 300 or 400 miles an hour, planes were now traveling as the primary aircraft were jets, often traveling over polar routes. So began the development of Loran B, C, D, and F, and some others you'll hear about. There were several technical decisions made in Loran A development to quickly field it, but those led to a system that was not really as accurate at long distance that we now needed. In the 50s, the Air Force, looking for greater accuracy, continued development of Cycle Loran, or Cyclan, which became Cycle Tactical, or CyTac. These systems took advantage of lower frequencies, allowed for greater accuracy at distances, and they had all been explored during World War II. But as newer technology came on that allowed for precise transmission and control, we were able to do it. The Air Force lost interest, but the Navy became interested, and the development continued. And eventually, that technology would become known as Loran C. The continued Coast Guard providing of their experience, and once again, Coast Guard was called again to run and operate the system. And you can see as the things have changed as we moved around. With Loran C came that new white form. That's that second squiggly line you saw on the first page. You can see it's become more refined, and from an outsider's view, it's more complicated, and to a degree, that's really a quick answer of what it is. These pictures show that the hardware also grew in size and complexity. The two things remained constant. There were tubes at the heart of the system, and there was always gray DoD paint covering everything. Although Master Chief in preparation did correct me, is that some of the East Coast stations that had been experimental with under the Air Force were painted in Air Force blue. Next slide, please. So even with the DoD missions in the background, Loran was still heavily used around the world by civilians. But in the early 1960s, Vietnam was neither a military theater or a commercial theater for that. When the Air Force first deployed to and over Vietnam, Loran simply didn't cover that part of the world. Enter Operation Tight Rein was initiated, which involved a warrant officer and $25,000 in a cash briefcase headed off to Thailand to the Commander Military Assistance Command. Establishing new locations to cover Vietnam was like World War II. Had to find the right location, the right geometry of the station in relation to each other, and they had to be supportable. However, as most of the needed coverage was over land, the stations no longer had to be on the coast, which was a change for the Coast Guard. By 1966, 3 stations were on air, broadcasting from Lampang and Satahip in Thailand and Con San Island in Vietnam. Eventually, a 4th station was added at Tan Mai, near the border between North and South Vietnam. Monitoring of the system was done from Udon, Thailand. So how did the Air Force actually use Loran? As you may know, Vietnam was prone to monsoon seasons. So the Air Force needed the ability to bomb in all weather. So what you'll see on the far left is the F4. It's a little hard to see, but you'll see right here, that's known as the towel rack. That's what a Loran antenna looked like. Some of the very first truly precision-guided munitions were developed by DoD during Vietnam, and Loran C played a part in getting because every precision munition needs to know precisely where it left from to be precise on where it goes. So if an Air Force project during the Vietnam era had PAVE in it, code name, PAVE Nail, PAVE Phantom, PAVE Buff, PAVE Sword, PAVE Knife, Loran was somehow involved in the background, helping them establish those munitions. Loran also served as pathfinders, as you see on this right-hand picture here. These are dowel rack equipped F4s leading A7 Corsairs. When the F4s knew they were in place, they dropped their bombs, and so did the Corsairs. For technical reasons that I won't bother you with, Loran C was not as accurate as you would expect today from GPS. But if you return to the same Loran C coordinates, you're going to be at the exact same place every single time. Whereas GPS, you'll wander around in a circle. Very tight circle, but it's not the exact same thing. Why does that become important? Well, when you're dropping sensors along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to try and monitor movement, you want to go back to that same spot. You don't care what latitude and longitude, you want to be there. So during Operation Igloo White, when they were dropping those, they were using Loran to help them figure out exactly where they were. It's also kind of important to go back to the exact space when you're searching for a downed pilot. And as you can see from the center photo, this is Tan Mai. This was the last station built. So you can see here is the 625-foot Loran antenna. And you can see a guard shack there, because this is just a little bit south of the north of the South Vietnamese border. So there are security concerns. But we have what since we learned is it was never really at risk from attack. I mean, they would pop off grenades and shoot at them every once in a while to remind them there. But the Vietnamese would use the tower as a visual reference point for their navigation on foot. So it was in their advantage to keep it up. Next slide, please. The time frame around the Vietnam War was incredibly impactful for the Coast Guard and its members. The era gave valuable leadership experience to both enlisted and officers. The crew on the left right there includes a bearded officer kneeling next to the sign right there. He'd become the 23rd Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Thad Allen. Master Chief Alan Thiele, who served at several Loran stations, became the 5th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, Senior Enlisted Advisor. As the war came to an end, Loran was still transmitting, though some of the members had been contracted out to unnamed agencies to operate after the Coast Guard was pulled out, but they were prior enlisted. Teletype message in the middle is the destroy all equipment, go off air message, and evacuate by Air America, interestingly enough. So at that point, there was no longer on air in the Vietnamese operational theater. The technical developments from that time frame improved the efficiency of the equipment, helped the transition from analog systems to transmitters and eventually digital. And importantly, based on the experience of operating Loran C over Vietnam, the Coast Guard was then able to expand the Loran C system across the continental U.S., where it previously only operated along the coast for harbor and offshore. The Mid-Continent Expansion Project provided complete coverage of the U.S., allowing aircraft to take longer trips more precisely across the middle of the continent. The pullback from Vietnam did not end the DoD support role, as new stations around the world were built where DoD forces might need navigation should the Cold War get hot again. And the photo on the right shows another aspect of the Loran C that still doesn't have a lot of public knowledge. That's this right here. This is a rack of gear, actually several racks of gear, known as Clarinet Pilgrim, whose purpose was to piggyback fleet ballistic missile messages on the Loran C signal. Very small data, but if everything's gone wrong, you don't need a lot to say launch. It was very highly classified. Some of it is still classified. And those who served at the station where this equipment was installed, the veterans will often tell you is, not exactly sure what it was did, but I was told not to ever touch it. So, next slide, please. So while we've just spent some time talking about the service Coast Guard provided in Vietnam and how significant the Vietnam era was to the Loran program, it should be noted that Loran C continued to operate around the world in support of both civilian and military users. As in post-World War II, the men and now women stood to watch in foreign lands. And like World War II, some of those stations were in remote places such as Cape Atoll, Greenland on the left, Yap Island in the middle in the Pacific, and Lampedusa, Italian island in the Mediterranean. Now, not all stations were isolated. Some crew members served at Silk, Germany on the Baltic Sea, considered one of the best vacation spots in Germany, while others were assigned to Spain on the Mediterranean coast. Meanwhile, further east in the Mediterranean Sea was Lampedusa. The station has two interesting footnotes to history. First, in 1979, Kay Hartzell became the first female to command an isolated U.S. military station. The second footnote involves Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. You may recall in the 80s, following several attacks on U.S. forces and civilians overseas, the U.S. conducted a retaliation mission to bomb them. Mission included F-111s that sorted all the way from England. They flew the whole entire way, lights out, electronically dark, so that they could not be detected, using inertial navigation systems. But what they were concerned with is that long a trip, were they still on course as they approached it? So what the weapons operators did, they turned on their radio for 2 quick sweeps, and they found the tower on Lampedusa and determined that they were 4 or 5 miles west of where they thought they were. And the pilots will talk about as they were flying below the height of the 625-foot tower. And those 2 quick sweeps gave them an idea of exactly where they were to allow them to then adjust and approach the coast on their projected course. In response to that attack, Libya fired 2 Scud missiles at Lampedusa, believing that the station was in fact a Navy communication station. The missile flew over the island, nobody was hurt, and things like that. But it did bring to most Coast Guard members' minds is that the Cold War could get hot, and the Cold War could get hot with Coast Guard people involved, which is something that we had not really thought about at the time. Slide 14. Or next slide, sorry. It's our hope that the takeaway from this presentation is that Loran was crucial to the Allies' victory in World War II. That the Coast Guard played a crucial role in the development and subsequent operation of this worldwide transformative electronic navigation system. And while the story is about technology, the real story is the Coast Guard civilians and active duty who made a truly successful program under very trying circumstances with immense pressure to succeed. It proved to be a worldwide leadership crucible for officers and enlisted. The Coast Guard Academy's engineering program is directly related to the need to produce officers with strong technical and engineering backgrounds. The Electronics Engineering Center was created to bring together active duty and civilians from throughout the Coast Guard to engage on tough engineering problems, and they set the beginnings of the Coast Guard engineering leadership that we still see active today. Next slide. I'll close with part of a congratulatory letter that Fleet Admiral Nimitz sent to the Commandant of the Coast Guard just following World War II. Quote, the installation, maintenance, and operation of Loran service in the Pacific Ocean areas by the officers and enlisted men of the United States Coast Guard contributed greatly in measure to the successful prosecution of the war against the Japanese. The navigational service afforded to our sea and air forces through the use of Loran service was of vital importance not only to the transportation demands and moving of troops and material, but in actual operations as well. End quote. So with that, I will always ask you to think about people who stood and watched.
Thank you, Gary. Okay. And next, we'll hear from Dr. William Thiessen with his presentation, 150 Years of Coast Guard Operations in Alaska and the Arctic. Dr. Bill Thiessen serves as the Atlantic Area Historian for the United States Coast Guard. He earned an MA from East Carolina University's program in Maritime History and a PhD from the University of Delaware's Hagley program in the History of Technology. His books include Industrializing American Shipbuilding, The Transformation of Ship Design and Construction, 1820 to 1920, and Cruise of the Dashing Wave, rounding Cape Horn in 1860. Over the past 30 years, Dr. Thiessen has published hundreds of naval and maritime history articles, reviews, essays, and stories in print and online, and he's currently primary contributor and managing editor of the Coast Guard's online series, The Long Blue Line, featuring weekly on my Coast Guard website. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I just want to thank Mark as chair for volunteering to serve, as well as Larry Hall for being our moderator, as well as Jensen for providing us with AV support. Thank you very much. All right. So just to be clear, in the agenda it's stated that this was primarily about the Arctic as well as Alaska, but it's also including polar operations in the Antarctic as well. For generations, the U.S. Coast Guard and its ancestor agency of the Revenue Cutter Service have played a primary role in U.S. ice operations. That role has depended largely on the spread of America's strategic and commercial interests into icebound regions. It has also depended on the transition from sail to steam and from wood to steel ships over the past 150 years. Next slide. During the 1800s, American maritime interests chased valuable resources such as seals and whales into icebound waters. And as U.S. shipping began to operate into winter months, the duties of the Revenue Cutter Service increased in frozen areas previously considered unnavigable in wintertime. In 1867, Alaska became a U.S. territory, luring adventurers and those exploiting natural resources on land and at sea. Alaska's vast maritime and coastal frontier required the support of the service's law enforcement, humanitarian, and search and rescue capabilities. So the revenue cutters patrolled Alaska's coastal waters as well as the Bering Sea. I just want to stress that throughout this 150 years that we're going to cover here, there's various competing trends taking place. On the one hand, you've got the geographic spread of the service from its core area of the East Coast through the Gulf of Mexico, up the West Coast, and finally into Alaska. But you also have the technological trend taking place where you have technology becoming more and more capable of handling major ice concerns in icebound regions such as the poles as well as domestic waters. And then finally, the interesting twist is that during this 150-year span, you're also seeing diminishment of ice, both in sea ice as well as domestic waters. So you have some of these trends kind of going in opposite directions at the same time. And yet you can see that right in these graphics here. This is a engraving of whales in the Bering Sea with whalers and whale boats in the background. This was sketched by actually one of our own revenue cutter captains prior to the Civil War. It shows how much the whales were actually feeding within icebound waters, driving the whalers up farther and farther north. And then you can see what the ice used to look like in those days as well. This wall of ice here is basically hiding a revenue cutter behind it that depended on sail and auxiliary steam to try to survive the ice pack. Next slide. So the service's first Arctic rescue attempt took place in the warmer months of 1880. During its 1880 cruise, the revenue cutter Corwin undertook a search for the missing Arctic exploration vessel USS Jeannette, which has been mentioned in a few seminars the past few days. The 1880 cruise established the annual Bering Sea Patrol, which the Coast Guard does today, as a primary mission of West Coast cutters. However, there was no trace of the missing exploration ship that first cruise. And during the second cruise that the Corwin took in 1881, Corwin deployed cuttermen by dog sled to search for shipwreck survivors due to the pack ice along Siberia's Arctic coast. And later, Corwin did enter the Arctic, passed through the Bering Straits up into the ice fields, landed men on uninhabited Wrangel Island and Herald Island, claimed them for the U.S. And it was later, after they successfully exited the Arctic, that the Jeannette had been lost in the ice with the loss of 21 crew members. And here you can see a kind of comparison of the two ships I'm talking about. Here's the Jeannette being crushed in the ice and sinking with the crew evacuating in its longboats and sleds. And then you see the Corwin here, which did those two cruises searching for the Jeannette, which had a reinforced wooden hull, did survive and managed to wait the pack ice out and float back out to safety during the warmer months. So it was treacherous. It was based a lot on luck as well as skill. Next slide. We have the revenue cutter Bear here, and this is Alaska's and perhaps the service's best known and most famous cutter. Even though an iron ship construction had begun well before she was commissioned in 1874, wooden ships were still believed to be superior ice-resistant vessels. The iron was simply too brittle and too thin to resist the pressures of pack ice. So Bear was heavily constructed with a reinforced wooden hull, a foot thick, with sheathing of Australian ironwood, and it also had a iron shoe fitted to its stem so it could actually push its way through leads in the ice. Not ice breaking, but simply trying to get through loose ice and out to open water. So in 1884, the Navy bought the Bear as well as the Arctic sealer Thetis for the rescue expedition of Lieutenant Greely's expedition to Ellesmere Island. In 1884, with the Bear and the Thetis, this is in Greenland, USS Bear, they steamed in June up to Ellesmere Island and actually rescued Greely and 5 of the surviving members of his 25-man crew. Next year, the Navy transferred the Bear to the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, and by 1886, the cutter was beginning to make the annual Bering Sea Patrol in Alaskan waters. So simply from a technological standpoint, I just want to make the point here that we're looking at vessels that were built to survive the ice. They're not necessarily built to break ice as we think of icebreakers today. Totally different type of ship. Next slide. Earliest attempt to navigate above the Arctic Circle in wintertime was the Overland Rescue, which began in November 1897, when Bear steamed north to relieve 250 starving whalers at Point Barrow, Alaska. Bear made it as far as Cape Vancouver, which is about halfway up the coast of Alaska to Point Barrow, and disembarked a dog sled team with a team of cuttermen and sled drivers with a herd of reindeer that they were pushing ahead of them for the whalers. 3 months and 1,500 miles later, the relief expedition had saved the icebound whalers. You can see a picture of the expedition arriving at Point Barrow with the iced-in whale ships in the background. That is March 1898 that they arrived. But the mission succeeded due to dog sleds more so than the actual cutters, because the cutter Bear remained stuck in the ice until the spring thaw. It never made it farther than Cape Vancouver. However, this rescue was considered probably the most daring, successful Arctic rescue in U.S. history, saving 250 lives at Point Barrow from starvation. However, nobody ever heard of it because Spanish-American War was raging at the same time. All the headlines were being captured by Manila and Cuba and all the other theaters of war for the Spanish-American War. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about a mission shift here for the Revenue Cutter Service. By the late 1800s, the era of wooden sailing vessels was fading. More powerful steamships were taking their place. And the Revenue Cutter Service began an aggressive approach of not just surviving in the ice, but breaking and clearing it for commercial shipping. This unofficial mission was not yet mandated by Congress or executive order. It began in 1908 with this ship here, the Androscoggin, which is based out of New England, and also another cutter that was based in the Chesapeake named the Apache. This one was designed with a kind of a spoon bow that you recognize today for icebreakers, and had extremely powerful steam engines so it could plow through ice. This type of vessel was unknown prior to Androscoggin. Year 1912 proved especially busy for these cutters. That year, sub-zero temperatures iced in the Gloucester fishing fleet off the coast of Newfoundland, and Chesapeake Bay froze solid, including the port of Baltimore. Androscoggin and Apache rescued icebound ships and opened the shipping channels in their respective areas. Now, by the way, ironically, this was the first icebreaker, but it was also the last cutter built of wood in the history of the Coast Guard. Next slide. In 1912 as well, RMS Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic, resulting in the loss of 1,500 lives. In response to the disaster, the international community demanded patrol of the ice zone for more icebergs. So the U.S. Navy assigned its scout cruisers for the remainder of the ice season in 1912 to patrol for icebergs. But in 1913, it refused to provide ships for that mission. So as a result, the Revenue Cutter Service assumed the duty of the International Ice Patrol. And the first cutter to initiate that service was Revenue Cutter Seneca, first one to make the ice patrol. Since the ice patrol was established, there have been no ships lost to icebergs within the patrol area, except during wartime when the ice patrol was suspended. And today those patrols are conducted by Coast Guard Aviation using computer drift models and satellite tracking drift buoys. Next slide. By the early 1920s, Coast Guard personnel with oceanographic training were needed for ice patrol duties. From 1923 to 1931, a Harvard University research unit headed by Lieutenant Commander Edward Iceberg Smith regularized the investigations for the ice patrol. In the summer of 1928, Cutter Marion departed Boston for the Davis Strait and Baffin Bay with Smith in command, applying his survey methods in productive iceberg calving areas. He also initiated a method of forecasting the number of bergs annually drifting south from Baffin Bay. The Marion expedition was the most comprehensive oceanographic expedition ever made by the U.S. up to that time, and Smith's research established the Coast Guard as an international authority in iceberg formation and And Smith had a very interesting life. He was awarded a PhD from Harvard for ice research. He also was the first Coast Guard officer to receive an advanced degree, such as that. And after his retirement from the service, went on to be the head of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Next slide. 1936, President Franklin Roosevelt officially mandated the Coast Guard's icebreaking mission with an executive order. So the Coast Guard was now officially required to keep open shipping lanes and ensure shipment of vital cargoes such as fuel oil, other foodstuffs, things of that nature. From the late 1930s through World War II, the Coast Guard built several classes of very capable icebreaking vessels, including medium endurance cutters, tugs, buoy tenders, and purpose-built icebreakers. In conjunction with the Navy, Coast Guard also built several wind-class heavy icebreakers for polar icebreaking. These capable, heavily armed ships would become the backbone of America's Cold War icebreaking fleet. And during the war, the service also built one-of-a-kind icebreakers such as the Storis and the Great Lakes icebreaker Mackinac, which are here, intended to keep open the Great Lakes shipping lanes. So you can see the first icebreaking tug built by the Coast Guard actually is 1934, so it predates Franklin Roosevelt's executive order for official mandating. But it actually was the forerunner of some of the most successful Coast Guard tugs used for icebreaking that were built up past World War II, I believe. You can see the Escanaba up here breaking ice in the late 1930s in the Great Lakes, medium endurance cutter. And she was home ported out of Grand Haven, lost in World War II as a part of Greenland Patrol, and is memorialized every year at Grand Haven as part of the Coast Guard Festival. And you can also see Mackinac here. She was actually kind of a modified wind class, but she was built so wide she couldn't exit the St. Lawrence Seaway. So she's been up in the Great Lakes ever since, and it's now a museum ship. Some people think it was sabotaged, they didn't want her to leave, but they needed the extra width to cut channels for Great Lakes bulk carriers. And then the east wind down here is one of the wind class. You can see it heavily armed, dual 5-inch turrets, fore and aft, and lots of other weaponry and modern communications technology. Next slide. World War II, Greenland was on the edge of the Battle of the Atlantic. The U.S. took control of the region for occupied Denmark, and the Coast Guard's Greenland Patrol oversaw this theater of operations. Cutters escorted convoys to and from Greenland, performed search and rescue, captured enemy trawlers and weather stations, and broke ice for strategic bases. Greenland Patrol vessels included ice cutters, such as the Bear and the Northland, which was built of steel but didn't have the power to actually break ice. So it was really more of a Bear and with modern building materials, as well as Escanaba class medium endurance cutters, tugs, as well as the Wind class icebreakers. And you can see the Bear up here is definitely different looking than looked in 1884. No masts, they're cut down for antennas, modern weaponry, had a diesel power plant instead of a steam power plant. So kind of a change in technology for the long-lived ship. And stay tuned if y'all monitor the news at all, national news or whatever. You might hear more about it next month. A little spoiler alert. Okay, next one. All right. Cold War ice operations. Beginning in the late 1940s, new military and scientific responsibilities grew in polar areas. A year after World War II, Coast Guard icebreakers found a challenging job in the Antarctic. The Byrd Antarctic expedition had been planned for the Coast Guard ice ship Northland in 1939. The war delayed this mission until December of 1946, when Admiral Richard Byrd took command of Operation High Jump using the Coast Guard icebreaker Northwind. Northwind opened navigation in the Bay of Whales, encountering ice 10 feet thick, pounding through an area a mile wide, 2 miles long, and 63 continuous hours of ice breaking, clearing the bay to offload supplies and personnel to build Base 4 of Little America. At one time or another, all 11 of High Jump's vessels were trapped in thick ice. 3 were holed and severely damaged. Transport Merrick lost her rudder, and Northwind had to tow her 1,000 miles to New Zealand for repairs and then returned to the Antarctic to complete her mission. Next slide. 1955, Coast Guard vessels helped build the Cold War's distant early warning line of Arctic radar installations to detect incoming missiles. These stations were required resupply in the winter, so the U.S. had to find a supply route along the Northwest Passage. In July 1957, the 230-foot icebreaker Storis and the 180-foot buoy tenders Spar and Bramble sailed north through the Bering Strait to attempt the crossing from west to east. 64 days, the cutters crossed all the way and completed the mission of the Northwest Passage. They were the first American ships to complete the Northwest Passage, and Spar also became the first ship to circumnavigate North America once it transited the Panama Canal and returned to Alaska. In 1969, the feat was repeated by the Northwind. You can see here with polar helicopters deployed. But this time the Northwind completed the passage and then returned back to Seattle using the Northwest Passage, becoming the first ship to transit the Northwest Passage in both directions in one season. So a lot of Northwest Passage activity during that. Next slide. Deep Freeze in 1955, the first Operation Deep Freeze Antarctic expedition took place, marking the Coast Guard's return to that region since High Jump. After 1965, these expeditions became an annual commitment for wind-class icebreakers such as East Wind and North Wind. They cleared up to 20-foot thick ice in the Antarctic during their deployments. They also supported meteorological and oceanographic research, and their helicopters provided services such as surveying and logistical support. And after 1980, the decommissioned old Wind class were replaced by the Coast Guard's new Polar Star class of heavy icebreakers for annual deep freeze deployments. Next slide. Since 1965, the Coast Guard has been the sole U.S. provider of icebreakers to the U.S. government. That year, the U.S. Navy transferred its fleet of icebreakers to the Coast Guard, as well as its icebreaking mission. With sea ice diminishing and international competition increasing around the North Pole, Arctic operations have greatly increased in importance. During this time, in August 2017, the Coast Guard's ocean-going buoy tender Maple retraced the route of the Northwest Passage from 60 years prior. As I speak, the medium icebreaker Healy is making that passage right now. And according to what I hear from reports, encountering no ice along the way, compared to what we saw at the beginning of this program. Kind of strange. Okay, next slide. During the past 150 years, the service's ice capabilities have given the U.S. the ability to project national interests into polar regions. In the 21st century, the service is embarking on an Arctic strategy based on a fleet of new heavy icebreakers. Polar Security Cutter Program will provide cutters with state-of-the-art icebreaking, propulsion, communications, and weapon systems. These new vessels will be capable of extended deployments that support the service's traditional missions in polar regions, such as maritime transportation, law enforcement, scientific research, search and rescue, defense readiness, as well as environmental response. With greater strategic and commercial interests in icebound areas, the advances in icebreaking technology, Coast Guard's ice operations have come a long way in 150 years, and in some ways are now more important than ever. Particular ship here, which has begun construction, is 460 feet long, it's 90 feet wide, and it comes with a price tag of $1 billion. It will be the largest and most expensive ship ever built for the Coast Guard. And 3 are slated for construction right now out of a class of 6. That's it, thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. All right, next we'll hear from our third panelist, Beth Crumley. Beth Crumley has served as the Assistant Historian of the U.S. Coast Guard since October 2017. prior to joining the Coast Guard Historian's Office, Ms. Crumley served as reference historian at the Marine Corps History Division and as an ordnance curator at the National Museum of the Marine Corps, where she was a member of the team that planned and opened the museum in 2006. She's the author of several blogs and articles, including the loss of U.S. Coast Guard cutters Jackson and Bedloe, aviation pioneer Frank A. Erickson, the 1964 Alaskan earthquake, and the development of the helicopter. Ms. Crumley also authored U.S. Marine Corps 3 Centuries of Glory and edited a legacy walk through Marine Corps and USNC, A Complete History. She's written numerous articles that have appeared in Leatherneck Proceedings and International Committee of Museum of Arms and Military History. Take it away, Beth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, some of you have been around Coast Guard headquarters for quite a while, and you know that on 22 January, members of the Coast Guard come together to celebrate the life and contributions of this man, Elmer Fowler Archie Stone. He was a cutterman, Coast Guard aviator, aviator number 1, test pilot, and an aviation visionary. Now, today I wanted to talk about his role in the development of powdered catapults and arresting gear. But I think before we look at that, we need to look a little bit at his incredibly interesting career. So he was born in New York and raised in Norfolk, and he joined the Revenue Cutter Service as a cadet at the Revenue Cutter Service School of Instruction, 28 April 1910. Next slide, please. After graduating with a curriculum in engineering in June 1913, he was commissioned a 3rd lieutenant, and he served aboard the cutters Onondaga and Itasca. And it's during this time that we can actually see the genesis of his love of aviation. In 1914, Itasca was home ported in Hampton Roads, and her mooring was next to the Curtis Flying School. Now, Stone's imagination was set afire watching these seaplanes fly and maneuver. The Atlantic Coast Aeronautical Station, next slide, was also located in Hampton Roads. Now, this was a training field for Canadian and American volunteers who would eventually take to the skies over war-torn Europe. And Stone actually had the opportunity to befriend many of them. And in 1915, encouraged by Captain Ben Chiswell, Stone met with Thomas Baldwin, who actually ran the station, and they discussed the idea of using aircraft in search operations. Baldwin offered the use of a Curtiss F-type flying boat. Next slide. And this was so successful that Stone received official blessing from the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Bertholf. And on 30 March 1916, Elmer Stone was ordered to Naval Air Station Pensacola for flight training. Now, he completed that flight school on 10 April 1917. He was Naval Aviator number 38, Coast Guard Aviator number 1. And on 2 July, Stone was assigned to the USS Huntington. Next slide. He was a Curtiss R6 pilot, and he was involved in the testing of the Catapult. And it was not the most successful endeavor because the Catapult's car was generally lost over the side during the launch. So this is a real problem. And it's a problem that's not lost on Stone. And it's one that he would end up revisiting later in his very distinguished career. So on 13 October, Stone was ordered to take temporary command of Naval Air Station Rockaway until the designated commanding officer arrived. Stone became the seaplane officer, and he spent the next 8 months flying. His natural abilities as a pilot did not go unnoticed. On 15 May 1918, he was ordered to the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair to inspect and test seaplanes. And he had the opportunity to conduct tests on a number of aircraft, far too many to talk about here. but if you ever go back and look through his notations on those tests, they're absolutely fascinating, and some of them are really quite funny. This one wasn't any good because it wouldn't fly, things like that. On 21 April 1919, Stone was ordered back to Rockaway in preparation for the first transatlantic flight. And at 10:00, 8 May 1919, NC 1, 3, and 4 lifted off with very little fanfare. Next slide, please. Stone was behind the controls of NC 4. I believe we've got a picture of, go one more. NC 4. This was not an easy voyage, and it was characterized by mechanical problems and by really crummy weather. NC 4 had only flown once prior to this departure, and the leg of the flight to Halifax was basically her shakedown flight. So after passing Cape Cod and heading out over the open sea, NC 4 suffered some engine problems. NC 1 and NC 3 ran into really heavy weather en route. Both decided to land, both hit hard and ended their voyage. Next slide. Some Navy art. So there's only one plane left, and that's the NC 4 with Elmer Stone at the controls. Now, there are some stories that the lieutenant commander, Albert Putty Reed, wanted to abort the mission because the weather was so bad. And those stories also say that Stone threatened to hit him in the head with a fire extinguisher. Is this true? I don't know, but it comes from pretty interesting sources, and it does make for a really good story. Now, at this point, NC 4 is also in bad weather, and Reed motioned to Stone to take it up, and the NC 4 broke out on top of the clouds at 3,200 feet. Now, as they approached the position of the next destroyer, the commander gave orders to descend for a visual check. And as they entered back into the clouds, the aircraft started to be buffeted, and it became very difficult to fly. They dropped the wing, and the aircraft went into a spin. Now, Reed shouted for Stone to do anything he could to bring this aircraft out of the spin, and to bring such a heavily loaded aircraft out of a spin in clear weather would have been an accomplishment. But the NC 4 had re-entered solid clouds. There was zero visibility. And to be able to bring it out of a spin with the rudimentary flight instruments then available was an absolutely amazing feat and a real testament to Stone's skill as a pilot. At 20:01, 27 May 1919, NC 4's keel sliced into the waters of the Tagus River. The welcome was tumultuous. A transatlantic flight, the first one, was now an accomplished fact. And here we see the crew of the NC 4. So after being lauded for his accomplishments, Stone returns to flight testing. And in September 1919, he actually refused an offer to transfer to the Navy with a promotion. He returned to duty with the Coast Guard. The Navy Department's Bureau of Navigation, his detachment orders stated, in parting with Lieutenant Stone, the Bureau desires to express its appreciation of the services rendered during the war. He is not only a skillful pilot, but an officer of excellent judgment and considerable technical attainments in the line of aviation, so that he proved himself peculiarly suited for the duties to which he has been assigned. Now, in less than a year, Stone is ordered to his second Navy assignment. He's to report to the Aviation Division of the Bureau of Construction and Repair. Now, Stone is remarkably suited for the tasks at hand. He's got an engineering background. He has a fine grasp of physics, and he has tremendous experience as a test pilot. So you could say this is pretty much a match made in heaven. So let's take a look at the status of catapult development prior to Stone's assignment. So in 1917, the Ford Instrument Company provided a blueprint for a pneumatic catapult to the Navy. And a year later, an international report was issued on the subject of catapult landings. This was an internal report. And by 1919, the decision was made to convert the Collier Jupiter to a catapult barge at the Washington Navy Yard. It was to be used in, quote, flying off platforms for shipboard airplanes. So flying off Jupiter, Stone again experienced some of those technical problems associated with pneumatic catapults. And the problem here was there was a difficulty in regulating the necessary air pressure. So there was little consistency in being able to maintain thrust. And so he was puzzled, like, how can this be solved? Well, he envisioned a gunpowder catapult design using 3 and 5 inch naval ordnance. Propelling thrust could be maintained. Now, according to a letter that was written by Carl F. Jensen, who was at the Bureau of Ordnance, on 14 December 1921, Lieutenant E.F. Stone suggested to me the use of powder as motive power for launching airplanes from catapults. So these two are now working together, and engineering drawings are being produced. Now, we talked about Stone's experience on the Huntington. He had actually designed a hydraulic brake that could solve the problem of the carriage flying over the side of the ship. And so the idea was to test that in tandem with the gunpowder catapult. Now, that test catapult was subsequently manufactured, and it was tested, and it was very successful. This is one thing I found very interesting about this. At this time, people were coming out of the woodwork saying, well, that was my idea, I designed it. And Stone and Jensen actually filed a US patent application. And amid all of this controversy, they're granted the patent. And the Navy JAG ruled that while neither Stone nor Jensen had any rights under the patent issued, Stone indeed, quote, invented the powder catapult. End of controversy. So by 1924, Commander-in-Chief Battle Fleet concurred with the installation of aircraft catapults and requested early installation for test. Now, a year later, a proposal is submitted to the Navy Department for catapult development, construction, and installation for the next few years. That proposal became Naval Aeronautical Policy. In 1925, Commander-in-Chief Battle Fleet alerted Bureau of Ordnance. All ships having catapults launched their planes and maintained good communication during force practice. Especially good work was done by the powder catapult. So Stone is successful, and his catapults are then installed on battleships and cruisers. So what does the future hold for Elmer Stone? It wasn't yet time to return to Coast Guard duties. His assignment at this point was to oversee the development and complete the testing of catapults and arresting gear on aircraft carriers. And this was a project that had actually begun in 1922. And once again, we need to look at the Navy's history in the development of carriers. Now, in 1920, budgetary battles led Congress to veto funding for aircraft carriers. So the decision is made to convert Jupiter. And in 1922, Jupiter becomes the USS Langley. I think we've got a photo. Yeah. So this former coal barge was going to be used as a test bed, not only for the gear, but also as a test platform for the conversions of Saratoga and Lexington. Now, Saratoga and Lexington were originally planned as battle cruisers, but these two ships would be a new class of aircraft carrier. Now, when they decided to turn them into aircraft carrier, pneumatic catapults and arresting gear were included in the modification requirements. I think we have a photo of one of the old pneumatic catapults here. Now, on 1 April 1922, Stone contacted Carl L. Norden. May have heard of him, or a little thing called the Norden bomb site. So Norden was working with Warren Noble Engineering Company, and they were looking at requirements for the arresting gear on Langley. According to Stone, the gear had to stop a 6,000-pound aircraft traveling 80 feet per second by uniform deceleration in a run of approximately 150 feet. Now, over the next few years, there's a flurry of letters between these men. There are design changes and engineering drawings are exchanged. They go back and forth, they were tweaked. But by 1924, engineering drawings had advanced to a point where prototype equipment was being manufactured. Testing was scheduled to take place at Naval Operating Base Hampton Roads. Now, it's important to think about what else was going on in the world at this time. 1920s, Prohibition, and the Coast Guard was very busy with the Rum War. There was a shortage of mid-grade officers. They were needed to command destroyers that had been acquired from the Navy. The Commandant of the Coast Guard, Rear Admiral Frederick Billard, I think we have a photo. Yes. He needed Stone back. And so he asked the Navy that his duty be terminated. And Rear Admiral William Moffett, we've got a picture of him, was commanding the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics at this point, and he contacted Billard. And if you look in Stone's service record, there's a series of about 12 to 14 letters going back and forth. I need Stone. You can't have him. And here's why. Well, I need him. And so, but basically Moffett said, I cannot commend too highly the work which Lieutenant Commander Stone has done in this bureau. It is owing to his technical ability, attention to duty, and perseverance that the development of the powder catapult has been perfected, made ready for production, and issued to the service. Lieutenant Commander Stone is still employed on catapult work and also on the installation of arresting devices for the new carriers Lexington and Saratoga. This work is of the highest priority at present in the Bureau, and because of this great importance and Stone's familiarity with it, it is necessary that he should continue in this Bureau. So a few more letters go back and forth. And finally, Moffett agrees to release Stone upon completion of these duties. Now, it got extended a little bit. There are all kinds of weird issues that cropped up. Contractual issues. People weren't being paid, and there were last-minute design changes. But on 26 January 1925, Stone received word that the new set of arresting gear will come from the Navy Yard Monday afternoon. Most probably, we can operate next Thursday. So formal test plans were finally in place. The two carriers were outfitted with the new catapults and arresting gear. And at the request of Saratoga's commanding officer, Stone's presence was requested on board. And, you know, Stone felt that was a great honor to be asked to be on the ship. And the designs proved very successful. So he is detached from the Navy, and he returns to the Coast Guard on 21 September 1926. 95 years after these extraordinary efforts, we continue to study. He ended up becoming XO of Modoc and then commanded Monaghan and Cummings. He didn't have another aviation billet for 6 years. Did that stop him from thinking about it? No. During these years at sea, he studied swell and sea conditions with the purpose of deriving optimal heavy sea landing and takeoff procedures for seaplanes. Stone went on. He served as the senior member of the trial board for new seaplanes being built by General Aviation Manufacturing, and in 1934 was assigned to Douglas Aircraft as an inspector. 20 December, he's flying a modified JF-2, and Stone established a world speed record for a single engine amphibian. Commander Stone's last duty was as commanding officer of the Air Patrol detachment in San Diego until his untimely death on 20 May 1936. He was literally inspecting an aircraft, went and sat down on a ledge and fell over dead. It was thrombosis. So I've talked to aviators about Stone's legacy, and some of the words that have been used to describe him were courage, backbone, grit, determination, tenacity, persistence, daring, forthrightness. His jealous Coast Guard Academy classmates belittled his achievements in the NC-4, yet his experience as a test pilot was unrivaled, and he made several record-breaking flights. He had uncanny foresight and ability in aviation. He had fine qualities of leadership, and he was respected, almost beloved, by those who served under him. Not only was he talented, but he was dedicated to an organization that did not always return the respect he earned. He was considered something of an eccentric and was at many times at odds with leadership and even disliked by leadership. But in talking to Coast Guard aviators over the years about this, including Larry, I've asked people, so what are your feelings about Elmer Stone? And I've heard things like, he's the foundation of Coast Guard aviation. He's the first of our breed. He gave us wings. Damn what he did. Stone's legacy is part of Coast Guard history, and it's part of American history. And his place in aviation history cannot be questioned or diminished. Thank you.
Thanks for that fascinating presentation.
You are quite welcome.
All right, we'll round up our panel this afternoon with a comment from Captain Larry Hall. He's a graduate of 1975 of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. He began his career as a deck watch officer on the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Boutwell in Seattle. Completing naval flight training in 1978, he flew the HH-52A Sea Guard helicopter at Coast Guard Air Stations Brooklyn, New York, and Savannah, Georgia, and as senior aviator aboard the icebreaker Coast Guard cutter Polar Star for Operation Deep Freeze and Arctic deployment. Following a headquarters aviation division assignment, Captain Hall flew the HH-65A Dolphin helicopter as operations officer at Coast Guard Air Station Group, Port Angeles, Washington, and executive direct officer, of the deputy group commander at Coast Guard Air Station Group, North Bend, Oregon. He then served as commander of the Coast Guard Group in San Francisco, California, finished his Coast Guard career as headquarters acquisition program manager for the C-130, Super Hercules, and C-37 Gulfstream 5 aircraft. He retired from the Coast Guard in 2005 and is currently volunteer extraordinaire with Coast Guard Historian's Office. So thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Mark. And thanks also for those couple kind words about my volunteer role with the historian staff. I really do feel like I'm treated as one of the help, not just this retired old fogey Coast Guard guy who comes in and sweeps up and runs the elevator. It's really fun to be treated as one of the help. Now that said, I'm going to start my comments by saying that I'm not coming to you as a historian wannabe. I love history though, and but I come to you as a Coast Guard operator and an acquirer with that keen sense of our history and a little tiny bit of which I helped make. So it's good to be here. So speaking as an operator, Gary, Bill, and Beth, yeah, you got it right. I loved your presentations. You got it right. Gary, he spoke of the art of shooting a star, and you saw the pictures of the guys with the sextants and whatever. At the Coast Guard Academy, I got an A in celestial navigation. They give you the numbers of the altitude of the star as it was shot perfectly, of course. I could do the math and come down with a 3-line fixed pinpoint on there. But, there I am on the Coast Guard cutter Boutwell on Bering Sea Patrol in 76 and 77. I couldn't shoot a star to save my life. All those problems you talk about, 40-mile boxes. At least I guess I could keep us off of the shoals in the center of the Bering Sea, as long as I knew we were that far offshore. So I did prove to be very good at lining up those waveforms on the Boutwell's Loran A set and plotting those time differences on the chart. And in that way, I kept the CO off my back. And luckily, the other thing is we never had good enough weather to try to shoot stars. So I didn't have to embarrass myself in front of the CO with some of these terrible star sites. So Loran is a lifesaver for me, and certainly it solved the problem for us in some very difficult environments. And then later, while performing Coast Guard missions far offshore in my helicopter, it really was pure magic. You talked about all the effort and all the science and all the technology that goes into the Loran Sea. What it boiled down to for a helicopter pilot was you look down at your Loran Sea receiver, and there's latitude and longitude, and you knew that all was well with the world. When we're far offshore. So, as an operator, what a wonderful thing
That was the man transmitting this
to keep us, and I really do appreciate that, from you and all the other Loranimals, the fact that you were on air and in tolerance. It made a huge difference to us operators. Bill, I was a senior aviator aboard, as Mark said, aboard Polar Star for deep freeze 87, 88, and I formed a great passion for that high latitude mission. Thank you for that succinct recap of our glorious history made in some awfully harsh environments where the water was indeed hard. And talking about those ships we had. One footnote I want to add that Bill didn't say though is, we're so proud and that we have this breakers and that we're the sole operator of all of the federal icebreakers since 1965, and really wanted to be there for everything. But if you know any of the history of the Polar class and how long it's been since we built the last one, you talk about the Polar Security Cutter being built now. As a cadet, in 1974, I went to Lockheed Shipbuilding. I was a marine engineering major and helped to build those 2 Polar class breakers. Look how old I am, and think about how old those ships are. In latter years, they become a terrible maintenance problem, and it actually came. Larry. I'm sorry.
Sort of like you.
Sort of like, well, at least they're still maintaining me, only with a few drugs. But there you go. Thank you. But it did come to a head back in the ice season for deep freeze 2010, 2011. The Polar Star had gotten in such a terrible maintenance condition, and the Coast Guard saw it was going to count. And there was also some funny budget stuff going on where Congress had given the entire the icebreakers mainly supported the National Science Foundation, although they did all Coast Guard missions, as you talked about so well with the requirements. But NSF had the money. They would pay to send us to the Arctic, send us to deep freeze in order to perform their missions, but they wouldn't give us 2 nickels for training hours or for other missions. It got to be a terrible condition for the Coast Guard. And when the Polar Star, we couldn't get money to maintain it. You just get it out there. And so they finally ended up laying up the Polar Star in Commission Special, and the Polar Sea then was the sole heavy icebreaker, and it worked until in summer of 2010, coming back to the Arctic. They had a terrible casualty. I think it was from bad lube oil, that they lost 5 of the 6 diesel engines running the generators for the diesel electric plant for its normal steam. So all of a sudden, Polar Sea came up lame. Polar Star was already decommissioned or in Commission Special with some plan to give it an overhaul. So at that point, National Science Foundation had to go on short notice to Sweden, where they chartered the icebreaker Odin to go do the deep freeze breakout. And by that time, Coast Guard had gotten the breaker Polar Star into the yard. They already decided it was going to be too expensive to fix Polar Sea. They cut out the hull to get those engines in and out. And it was for 2 more years, they had to charter a Russian icebreaker to do the break-in. So it was actually the Russians that bailed us out for 2 of those years. It was bad enough to have the Swedes, and it broke my heart after having been on the continent to see a Swedish icebreaker in McMurdo, but a Russian. Wow. I'm a little bit ahead of my script, but I just want to add that note that we are now back to proudly operating, and now we finally have convinced Congress, we've developed the requirements, that sort of thing, and we got the appropriation. Now we're back to getting health back into our icebreaker fleet. So I'll go to Beth, and as you know, any Coast Guard aviator worth hers or his salt can recite Elmer Stone's story from memory, and his first of his exploits in the NC-4. And we really do enjoy throwing it back to the cutter folks that Elmer Stone did command 2 cutters, more than a lot of cutter people did. But learning of his continued contributions in naval aviation, that makes me all the more proud. So thank you for your great presentation. So there I am. I'm trying to find a common context for this Loran, icebreaking, and Elmer Stone story. And I fall back to one of my other passions, that of organizational and operational requirements. Okay, I see Janet Arlen's eyes rolling because I wax poetically. There's one more slide that hopefully you can throw up on it. I actually provided a slide for my comments. Is it in there, Mark?
It is. We saw it yesterday.
It should say requirements. There we go. If you can get that up into the big print. It's sort of small print, but this is out of Title 14 U.S. Code. And, well, let me go back. That I'm a requirements wonk. I'll confess it. It's out there. Now you know. And a well-crafted set of requirements. The what shall a system or an organizational do, agreed upon by all stakeholders, can give greater meaning and definition to that system's utility or to the organization's mission. It can reduce pain and suffering for acquisition of major capital assets. And in the best traditions of the greater naval service, it can settle arguments and win your beers at the bar. Okay. So on the screen here, you're going to see the highest level requirements of what the Coast Guard shall do. And it's a little bit of paraphrasing of Title 14, sections 101, 102. And it does start out saying, we're a military service, always have been, always shall be. And I did not put in there how we, by either presidential executive order or by when Congress declares war, we can be sent into the Navy as a specialized service operating under the Chief of Naval Operations. And that's happened twice during both world wars. Otherwise, we can maintain that state of readiness to assist, and we can operate with the Navy when they put us under Title 10 orders. You see that, you've seen that most lately with the national security cutters that are leading the charge on those freedom of navigation cruises, transits through the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. Having that white ship out there with the red stripe changes the entire optic of that operation. It still projects our U.S. government policy, but a little bit softer. And the Coast Guard is the main force behind that. So I want to look at what we learned from the 3 presenters today, and with an eye toward of, what does the nation require? Anything we do can be boiled down into one of these 8 statements on here. So, Loran, you see there that we need to operate aids in maritime navigation, and some other stuff to promote safety on the high seas and waters subject to the U.S. jurisdiction and fulfill U.S. defense needs. Loran does it or did it in spades, and they even found a better use. You know, they got B-52s, they got bombs on time, on target, using and the other aircraft are shown using the Loran, which, okay, that's within our purview. That's our job. Okay. Excuse me. Let me advance my script here. Ice breaking. You know, we now own all the icebreakers, and we do all those things. We enforce U.S. law. We do all those missions. One thing I really like, though, there's one here, you know, that we do Coast Guard missions within water subject to jurisdiction of U.S. and U.S. defense needs. This is a new one since I did the polar study. Per international agreements, we operate ice-breaking facilities on waters other than the high seas and those subject to the U.S. jurisdiction. If you've ever been up to the Great Lakes in the winter, you might sometimes see when the U.S. icebreaker goes at the Canadian side and the Canadian comes to our side. Okay, we're legal. Okay. Now, back in 1985, though, and this when the Healy first made a Northwest Passage transit, we didn't ask the Canadians. The U.S. maintains that the Northwest Passage is an international strait. Canadians don't agree. Healy went through, caused a huge kerfuffle, PAO disaster, but we tried to stand our ground. Well, when all the dust settled, we agreed to disagree. And so even though the U.S. federal government still maintains international strait, we agreed that we will ask Canada permission before we go through. But still, we're going through waters, somebody else's water, but we can legally do that. And as you say, Healy, as we speak, is transiting the Northwest Passage. They're going to be making a full circumnavigation of North America. And let me see here. So given this context of this requirements, Bill, I'm actually going to let you off the hook because you talked about that. How our operations do satisfy all of these requirements and what the Coast Guard shall do in the environments that are best covered by the icebreakers. But Gary, I want to ask you, and I'll pose these two questions and then we can answer it in the end. And I don't know if anybody else will have other questions when we're done. But for Gary, many agree that if we get into an active conflict with one of our near-peer competitors right now, usually that means China or Russia or one of those kind of folks, one of the first casualties is going to be the GPS constellation and its capabilities. So given our Title 14 responsibilities, is there something we can learn from our Loran history that we might advocate for in order to keep the U.S. forces in the navigational game should that bad thing happen?
Absolutely. In 2010, when we shut down the navigation system, and I did that by my role as CO, not because I wanted to. I had just been in the midst of a $157 million upgrade that would have allowed what was called E-Loran to operate at much lower cost, completely automated, with better accuracy and robustness. It was a budgetary decision on why it was shut down, not any good practical reason. It is not as accurate as GPS, but if GPS is gone, some really bad things have happened. So maybe we don't need centimeter accuracy, and 10 feet is good enough for the crisis. So yes, it has a great critical role. And I would say that the one thing I would point out is when I was at Staff College, one of the things DoD folks taught me was if you're looking at a potential conflict, you always want to wonder about what your enemy is going to do. And I would point out that both Russia and China have thriving Loran C systems that they operate to this day, continue to expand, and increase its robustness. So when your near-peer competitors that you fear are doing something, you might want to think about doing it yourself instead of shutting it down.
I'll ask you a follow-up before I get to Beth. I saw that, in the early days, we did Loran from the back of trucks and that sort of thing. How long would it take to get that sort of capability stood back up again?
It could, in a wartime crisis, it could be done within months. There is an active E-Loran program development going on. Korea has added it. Other countries are adding it. And there is a US-based company doing that work. So it's a matter of convincing the federal government to do it and just then build the transmitters.
Thank you. Beth, I'm going to go down to this last one, you know, to maintain the state of readiness to assist in the defense of the U.S., including when we are functioning as a service in the Navy. And I believe that when Elmer Stone made the NC-4 flight, we were still part of the Navy for that one, but his other work was not. So we were helping maintain that state of readiness. That's one person, of course, you know, the personal hero of any good Coast Guard aviator. But can you cite any other examples of where we had such uniquely good capability and talent that we were able to help the greater good within this, I like to call it the small end naval service?
I certainly think we do. It might be completely different circumstances, but the first thing that comes to mind is, you know, in the landing exercises prior to pushing the Pacific campaign, you know, there are reports that state, you know, Navy personnel proved frustratingly inept in small boats. And so what did they do? They turned to the Coast Guard, who are the masters of small boats, to get people from ship to shore. And you ended up with Naval Operating Base Cactus, and which was the only fully Coast Guard staffed naval operating base. And that's how you ended up with Doug Monroe saying being 500 of Chesty Puller's Marines.
Right.
The other two things that come to mind is Stu Graham, Coast Guard helicopter aviator #2, who did groundbreaking work with the Navy in anti-submarine warfare. And when the Navy was going to take over that role, it was Stu Graham who was teaching tactics and, in fact, teaching pilots for the Navy before they stood up their first anti-submarine squadron. The other one I think is maybe even a little more different, but probably most interesting of all, is Frank Erickson and William Costler and the development of helicopters, because the Navy wasn't interested and the Coast Guard was. And as that program flourished for a little bit and then tanked because of all this infighting at headquarters, and you had, you know, the fixed wingers, and Erickson's response to that was frozen wing, frozen mind, and leadership took over that basically, you know, sort of kicked him to the curb. But then the Navy took over, and it actually was Erickson who ended up training some of those first Navy pilots. So I think, yeah, maybe under different circumstances, but I think those are three really good examples of that.
Thank you. That concludes my comments. I would love to turn over to more questions if they are, either in the room or amongst our virtual attendees.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, panel. And yeah, well, are there any questions from our audience?
Yeah. Are there any of those old prototype catapult and arresting devices around that you're aware of today that have been saved?
I'm not sure. I've heard that the Naval Museum down at Pecola might have one, but I'm not sure if they do or not.
I'm sorry, Bob.
Yeah, I was at a session earlier where they were talking about the preservation of Cold War, you know, basically artifacts in the mega sense of the word. What have they done? I mean, Loran, for Coast Guard practical purposes, is gone. Do you know if they've, you know, done documentation on Loran Station and some of those kinds of things to save that history that you talked about? So there is some documentation on it. Done under some historic statutes requirements for the shutdown in Alaska and some other places. Quite frankly, Master Chief's website, Loran History Info, has got more than anyone else. He's worked very hard to accumulate that. Interestingly, is the Loran Sport Unit, Wildwood, New Jersey. In the transmitter building, we still have a tube type transmitter, the first solid state transmitter, and the next generation all sitting there. If I could convince the Coast Guard Historian's Office to accept them, but otherwise, they're still in Coast Guard custody. So we have visible understanding of what they were. But they are big pieces of equipment. this is more of a pointing out things, Elmer Stone is, the godfather of, aviation kind of stuff. If you're an iceberg hunting guy, it's Iceberg Smith, and they were classmates. That was a hell of a class. The class of 1913, I can't imagine there's any other class that comes by. I mean, Bob Paulson was in there, Smith was in there. I mean, there's some, a couple of Smiths.
Yeah, there's a lot of flag officers in that one too.
Yeah, quite a class. And I think there was like 12 of them.
Yeah.
13 or something.
Sir in the back.
The Loran station at Johnston Atoll, is that on the big island or on one of the three little? No?
Bill, do you remember which one?
The original one was on Johnston, and the Loran C was on Sand.
Same, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or anything from the virtual audience, through the chat function on the?
No questions, sir.
Okay. All right, Bill.
Yeah,
Mark,
thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to our panel.
All right.